Hello, everyone, and welcome to this presentation, The Elephant in the Room, Identifying Giftedness in Underrepresented Populations. My name is Kim Lansdowne, and along with my colleagues, Jack Naglieri and Dina Brulles, we have a presentation on the tests that we have recently developed and how you can use them, and some programming options for students in your gifted programs. Jack and Dina and I have been working on this, I'm going to call it a passion project for 20 years plus. This is something that we are dear to our hearts, and we are just so very happy to be with you today to talk to you about this issue. My colleague, Jack Naglieri.
Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and to be able to share with you the rationale and the details of this work that we've done to achieve equity. And I'll just leave it at that.
Dina?
Are you going to change slides?
You want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Dina Brulles. I am the Director of Gifted for Paradise Valley Unified School District in Phoenix, Arizona. And I also teach at the Arizona State University in the Gifted Master's Program. I'm also on the board of directors for NAGC as the governance secretary. So this presentation today is going to address some of the things that Kim was saying that she and I and Jack have been working on for many, many years, but also the topic that I work on daily in my job as a gifted coordinator in a district that's pretty diverse. And so the presentation today, to get the big picture, is that we're talking about ways to identify students who might not be fluent in English, might not have good grades, might have missed some opportunities to learn that other students had the benefit of. And this is a presentation that really talks about how kids think, how smart kids think, and how we can better identify those students who might not look as smart as others because they've lacked some experiences prior to coming to the school. So we're going to start off by just talking about how many students have we missed to recognize their potential and their gifted potential, and to be able to make a difference with those students in our schools.
So over the years, we've seen a lot of research about the percentages of Black and Hispanic and Native children who have not been identified. And what we really wanted to do was get a better sense of just how many people out there who could have been identified and gifted and weren't. And so I started digging through the numbers. And in our forthcoming book, Understanding and Using the Naglieri General Ability Tests, A Call for Equity in Gifted Ed, we've presented these data where we looked at the number of children in public ed, the number of potentially gifted children using top 8%, and then just calculating the number of students in gifted program and the difference between how many kids potentially could have been identified and how many were. And as you can see, Black, Hispanic, Native, and children of two or more races, there's a lot of them. In fact, nearly 875,000 students. On the bottom side, left-hand side of this chart, we have the data for ELL students, and those may likely overlap with the big chart, but nevertheless, that's about 250,000 people right there. But the thing is, I was looking at the number of children missed, meaning the number of children who were administered some kind of procedures to identify them. If you look at the number of school districts that do and don't identify students, then we can better evaluate how many students of color are in our entire country, whether or not the district actually has a procedure for identifying and/or helping them. And then the number increases by nearly 400,000 to 1.25 million. So in our public schools today, K to 12, there's more than 1 million students of color who could have been identified as gifted and weren't. And that's just not right. So when Dina and Kim and I talk about equitable assessment and equitable identification, there are a couple of things that we need to clarify. The first is that when we talk about a gifted student, we're talking about a very smart one. And a talented student is a very knowledgeable or accomplished person. So you can be gifted and not very knowledgeable. You can be knowledgeable and actually not very gifted either, if you have opportunities, extra opportunities. And of course, you can be gifted and very knowledgeable. So when we talk about gifted, we're saying it's not necessarily the kid who gets all A's. It's not necessarily the kid who comes to school all well prepared all the time. But that could very well be a really smart person. And so in the way in which students are identified potentially for gifted program, and that's a referral system if it's by teachers and parents. Well, we know that that's problematic. We know that very clearly. But there's something that's been kind of hidden. And what's been hidden is the role that knowledge plays in the intelligence tests that are often used to identify children. They have verbal directions that have a lot of verbal concepts. And the students need to understand the directions in order to perform. Oftentimes there's verbal and quantitative test questions that demand knowledge. And in the case of individually administered tests that are often used like a Wechsler scales, the student needs to have good expressive language skills. And so using a test of ability that demands knowledge is really the essence of the problem as it relates to equity. Now, if we look on the next slide at the number of percentages of districts that look for intellectually gifted, that would be really smart, and academically gifted, we see it's pretty high and it's pretty similar. But what's really interesting in the next slide is that we're going to show you the most often used tests for identification of gifted children. And as you can see at the top is the COGAT and the WISC. And then just below that, the Woodcock-Johnson, the ITPS, and the Otis-Lennon. So if you look at these 6 tests, 5 out of the 6 are dependent upon knowledge. Now, if you're a teacher and you never actually saw what an IQ test is, just to let you know, you'll see vocabulary test on an IQ measure. You'll see math word problems on a test that's supposed to measure intelligence. We don't think that's right, and we're not the first person to talk about this. In fact, in the next slide, I'll introduce you to Rudolf Pintner. In his book, which I have on my shelf right next to me here, Rudolf Pintner in 1923 noted that a good intelligence test must avoid as much as possible anything that is commonly learned by the subjects. In a broad sense, this rests on the differentiation between knowledge and intelligence. And he goes on to actually say, to ask the question, who discovered America, which was an item on the WISC that I used to ask when I worked as a school psychologist all the time. So what we're saying is may not be new, but it's been ignored. And when you ignore that fact that knowledge interferes with identification of gifted kids, you get a situation like which occurred in U46 school district. So I won't go through all the details of this particular court case, but the essence of it was the district was 42% Hispanic, but only 2% of the kids in gifted were Hispanic. Something's not right there. And when the case was litigated and the judge ruled that the district intentionally, italicized, in the court records, discriminated against Hispanic students. And the way that they did that was they used verbal and math scores for screening, and they used a weighted matrix, and the weighted matrix favored verbal and math scores, and they basically ignored the score that they should have paid the most attention to, which was the nonverbal test score. Because a student with a high nonverbal test score is gifted, even though they may not be accomplished. So the weighted matrix was a problem. Too little reliance on the nonverbal score was a second problem. But there's actually an additional problem that we have today, and that is the problem of COVID. So it's no surprise to everybody that COVID has really exaggerated and deepened the disparities in our country, as I describe on the next slide. Students of color have fallen further behind, but even everybody's fallen behind. Most people have been falling behind. So what that means is the intellectual scores, the scores you get from a COGAT and a WISC, those are even more problematic because now students are being compared to other students who did not have the COVID impact on their learning. So here's the thing. The U46 court case reminds us that how test scores are used are just as important as which tests are used. Just because you have a fair test, and maybe even if you use a fair test, it doesn't necessarily mean the entire assessment process is going to be equitable, because it depends on how you manage all the numbers. And to find all gifted students, the entire identification process must be equitable. And to achieve equity, we have to remember the key to equitable assessment is measuring how well a student can think in a way that's not confounded by what they know. And if you as a teacher are looking at some work that a student does and you're wondering what's going on, you can ask this same question. So what if a student isn't doing well in reading comprehension? And you ask the question, what does the student need to know to complete the task? Well, maybe the student doesn't really know the language that the story is written in very well. So their knowledge is interfering with their ability to comprehend. Comprehending is the thinking part. But if a student knows everything they need to know to solve the problem, then we measure how well they can think. And that's what we want to know. How well can a student think to solve problems? And that's what we're going to show you next. So Dina, why don't you introduce this, given that you're going to talk about the verbal side first anyway.
So we told you we've been thinking about this for about 20 years. Well, about 5 years ago, Jack came up with an idea of how we could measure the way a student thinks if that student might not have some advantages to have as much knowledge gained as some other students who we typically identify pretty well on a test that does include a lot of language. So basically what we wanted to do was take the language out of the test. Why we think it's so important, especially for this group, to be thinking about this. So we explicitly made the test to seek equitable identification from students from diverse cultures, linguistic capabilities, or socioeconomic backgrounds. And what we did come up with was a way to measure both verbal, nonverbal, and quantitative ability approaches to high ability in a format that requires very limited amount of academic knowledge. And so these tests that we're going to share with you are items just to show you how this works. You'll see that the test items can be answered based on the way a child thinks regardless of whatever the language they speak, because these tests have no words in them, yet they still measure ability as measured verbally and quantitatively in addition to non-verbally. So even the directions, you'll see we've removed the need for direct communication through language. We can use some of that, but basically what we've used is animated instructions to show the students how to answer the question and what the goal is on each of these items that they're going to be seeing. So it is currently online, but eventually we will have some paper items as well. But here we're going to just introduce to you really quickly the verbal, quantitative, and the nonverbal examples of how the test is designed. So the verbal ability test, I worked on with Jack, and we based this on the way that language is developed, based a lot on Alexandra Luria's language cognition, which means we're using pictures and objects that represent verbal concepts without the actual words. So the items that we identified here are all comprised of universally recognized pictures that do not rely on language acquired in academic settings, but they're also universally understood in concepts that are equally recognized throughout whatever culture or language. So we did a lot of work with different folks from different cultures, and to have these screened to make sure that they were not culturally offensive or they were easily understandable by students regardless of what culture they come from and what language they speak. So with the verbal, the student's task is to identify which of the 6 pictures does not represent the verbal concept that's shared by the other 5. And we start off very easy in order to show the students how to answer the questions and make sure they're getting them. But this is what I was talking about for the animated instructions. So here you see, y voy a hablar en español. El niño está pensando en los dibujos, los picturos, y está pensando, oh, ¿cuál es diferente? So the student is looking at the questions and trying to decide what's the same and what's different. Then he goes and selects the wrong answer on purpose so that he can show you how to correct if the student did the wrong answer and wants to change their mind. So they went back to the chair, said it's not a fruit, and then the arrow allowed him to move on to the next test item. And this is, like I said, the sample ones to make it very simple to show the students how to answer the questions, and they become very complex and a lot of thinking involved in these to answer these questions.
And the nonverbal is designed to measure general ability. Only in this case, the content is shapes and relationships among those shapes. So when in the verbal test, it's designed to measure general ability using verbal concepts. Here we're using nonverbal stimuli, so to speak. So the items are made in a way that all the information you need to solve the problem is on the page, just like in the previous one that Dina just showed. And what I did here is basically take the NNAT concept that I've been using for decades and expand it out and develop new kinds of items that hadn't been used before, so that we have a freshening of the approach, so to speak. But it gets at general ability using nonverbal stimuli, and the video animation works very well, much the same way. Pull away, thought bubble, directs the child where to look at the top of the screen, then directs the child to look at the options, and then we show which option is the correct one. And of course, we always want to make it easy for the student to understand. If they make a mistake, just change it and move on. So that's the nonverbal scale.
So the quantitative portion, again, measures general ability using quantitative concepts with numbers and symbols and shapes. And again, it is using logic behind relationships but not having any language that goes along with it, with the directions and with the testing as well. Math is a universal language, regardless of the language that you speak. The concepts with math are the same, and so there's limited. There is some mathematical skill that goes along with it, but it's very, very basic. And so here's an example of one of the sequence problems. The student looks at that and counts in their head in whatever language they speak. I would happen to say 6, 7, 8, 9, and the next one that would be correct in that sequence would be 10. So the items have no verbal requirements, but also the directions don't have verbal requirements, which is a pretty big difference with how kids are assessed on other types of IQ tests. So once again, the student is looking at, this is a scale item, right? And so the student is looking at this, trying to decide what would go where the question mark is, again, a universal sign. And so the two triangles are equal to the two squares. So students trying to figure out the one triangle would be equal to what? Here are all of the answers that the student can choose. And the correct answer is A. So looking at it then from a whole picture, two triangles go along with two circles in the same way that the one triangle is equal to one circle. And so the directions for all three components of this are done through animation. Beautiful thing, especially for those of you that are in a room that have stood in front of a whole group of students. Dina and I this many times. It's just, always especially fun with kindergartners, right? Where you're reading long directions for these types of assessments. So it is just very simple.
Now, it's important for us to spend just a little bit of time letting you know that we've already looked very closely at the extent to which these three tests yield similar scores by gender, by race, by ethnicity, and by parental education. So this is 3 separate studies on about 1,000 people who K to 12 closely match the US population. So that means there's replication of the concept. The concept, the hypothesis was, if you take out the knowledge out of the measurement of ability, can you have a verbal, a nonverbal, and a quantitative test that is more equitable? And equity in this instance is about the content of the tests and the mean scores that are obtained, the average scores. So males and females get the same overall score, on each of the three, by race, by ethnicity, and by parental ed. So this is very, very powerful finding. So even though the tests, and we also looked at reliability and confirmatory factor analyses and a lot of other sophisticated bias analyses and all that is in the manual, which is really jam-packed with all this information. If you're into all the nuance and detail, take a look at the manual. But the really interesting thing here is that the three different kinds of tasks, they all measure the same general ability. We've said this several times today, but it really needs to be more carefully examined, because it's not unusual for people to say, well, so-and-so's verbal intelligence score is, or their nonverbal intelligence or nonverbal ability. I have for many years reminded people there is no such thing as nonverbal ability. There's no such thing as verbal ability either. There's no such thing as reading ability or math ability either, by the way. We oftentimes use this term ability in an imprecise manner. But as it relates to these three tests, they all measure this concept of general ability. But what is the general ability? This goes back actually to Pintner and who preceded Wechsler. But Wechsler clearly believed in the concept of general ability. He never believed in verbal and nonverbal as separate types of intelligence. But we have been taught, I was taught as a school psychologist, to interpret his test scores in that manner, and that was wrong. Wechsler saw what we would call the performance scale or the nonverbal scale, the most sensible way to measure general ability of people with limited proficiency in English. So in our book, Helping All Gifted Children Learn, we tried to help people understand that this concept of general ability is like a foundation. And it allows people to solve a lot of different kinds of problems that can involve many things: sequencing, memory, understanding relationships, making connections, inferences, and a whole host of things. But the key is to measure general ability in a way that's not confounded by knowledge, because that's the only way you're going to really get equity.
So, Dina, I know that you're going to talk about implementation, but I think it's important to just pause right here and have just a quick clarification moment of this paradigm shift that we've talked a lot about. And many programs across the country identify on those things that Jack just said don't really exist, or we confuse them. So students that qualify on a quantitative reasoning portion of an assessment, generally we move those kids into an advanced math program, or kids that qualify on a verbal, we put them into a higher level math program, or but we're really talking about a paradigm shift here, and you are in schools every single day, and you're making these decisions every single day. So what do you say to a teacher right now that's sitting in the audience, because I'm gonna play that teacher right now, that says, in my district, that's how we identify kids and that's how we place them. And so your answer is what to that?
So you're right. I'm going to go into a little bit more discussion on programming later, but basically the way I answer that is that it's the construct of the test item that makes it verbal, quantitative, or nonverbal. They all are measures toward general ability. So for example, when I went into my current school district about 16 years ago now, the students that were identified on a verbal test, they put into honors English, honors reading. Those students identified on a quantitative battery or test, they put into honors math. So I said, well, what do you do with the students who are identified on a nonverbal ability test? They said, oh, we bring them into on Fridays for the last 20 minutes of math. And I said, what do you do for that? She said, we play logic games. And I said, why do you do that? And they said, because they're really good at them. So I said, you're going to take a child who's really good at problem solving and it has all this ability, and you're going to give them more of the same thing. Shouldn't you be equating that with what the purpose of schooling, with all that we learn in school? And they said, well, we can't put them into the regular gifted program because they don't do as well as the other kids. And I said, well, of course they don't, because you're not treating them as if they're gifted. You're not using that ability to help them progress in their academics. And they said, well, if we did that when they got to middle school, the middle school honors teachers they say that we know who the nonverbals are. So my response there is there's no such thing as a nonverbal human being. We all think with language. And that's the point we were trying to make earlier. We all may speak with a different language, but we are still thinking with that language. So if we take that language out of the test, we're able to capture more of these students who might think with a different language. But they still are measuring to very high ability. So what I did was I said, okay, we're going to put them all together in the gifted program, and then we're going to figure out their strengths, and we're going to build on those strengths. And after just a couple years of doing this, those middle school teachers, they couldn't tell the difference who was identified on a verbal, quantitative, or nonverbal ability to battery or test, because we treated them all as if they had high potential, and they lived up to that because we were able to nurture that. And first of all, see it and then work with that. And so that's pretty much the premise of what we're doing here. We're trying to identify that potential regardless of the language that they speak, and honoring that they have this ability that we need. It's our responsibility as educators to develop that, and through a myriad of different ways that we're going to talk a little bit more about later. But that's just the background on that.
Which leads so beautifully. What a beautiful segue right into this quote. So we do the best we can with what we know. And when we know better, we do better. I love that. So one of the concepts that it's been around for a long time, but it's during COVID and this push to find underrepresented populations in gifted programs. We are saying that using local norms is a strategy to help you increase your underrepresented populations. And so just a quick little tutorial here on national norms and local norms. And so for years and years and years as a district coordinator for gifted programs, every single student that I looked at, I compared to national norms, meaning that I was comparing each student's performance to peers from the same age group or grade from across the country. And many of us do that and have done it for a long time. That is really the norm. The problem with that, though, is that there were so few schools that I've ever seen that the population looked like the national population. And that's really a problem. So you're comparing kids to a group that isn't representative of the school or the grade. So local norms is exactly what it sounds like, right? You're comparing your students' performance to the school grade level peers in the same district or in the same school, or even in a specific grade, or even in a particular category of students. And so what you're doing is you're comparing the kids to the group that they are in an instructional group with, grade. And so you're looking for those kids that are so different from that norm of that group that they really require additional services in order to meet their needs. So the local norm, it's just looking at a particular group, and you can choose that group. We can help you. We've got a lot of support for you. but that's your choosing to choose the group that you're comparing. Now, there's some things that we want you to consider, though, when you are using local norms. One is that they are not portable, or they may not be. Let's just say that. They could be, they may not be. So if you are moving to a different school or to a different district, that comparison group is different, right? So you would not necessarily take those particular scores and hand them to the coordinator in the new district and receive services. Then the other that Dean is going to talk about so much more is identification for what, and you've already addressed that a little bit, Dina, and I know that you're going to do that more. And so we'll move on to the goals of education. So Dina, you want to take this from here?
So there's so many different aspects of things that what we do in school that we have to stop and consider. Is this really providing equity to all students? Equitable access and inclusion is not going to be the same for every student in every different school. It could look different because of what Kim was just saying, based on the population at that school should determine the access and who's included. If we have equitable treatment, but like Kim was saying, where everybody at a 97 percentile or above on a national norms gets identified, that is not equitable treatment because these students have diverse backgrounds and diverse levels of preparation. And the same thing with all the other aspects that we do in school. But before, and you can move on, I want to tell you about, oh, I was ahead of myself. Okay, so these are 3 questions I want you to think about. Do all the students in your schools believe that the schools have their best interests at heart? Do they all believe that getting a good education will benefit everybody in the same way? And do they all believe that each can pursue educational goals with the same outcomes in mind? Now, I'm going to tell you briefly about 2 students in my district. The first one is Vanessa Minera Leon, and she was a 2nd grader at the time of this story. And you can move to the next one. And the second student is Alejandra Gaindo. And these 2 girls, they didn't know each other. One was a 2nd grader. I was a large school district with 47 schools. Vanessa was in 2nd grade when elementary school. Alejandra was a junior at a high school in a different area of town. Well, I had written a story, an article on trying to talk about how to identify ELL students. And at the time, the educational reporter for NPR, he heard that story and he wanted to come to my district and follow these girls around, some kids around. So we followed about 4 or 5 students, and he ended up selecting these students to study. And what we found was just shocking. And I know that you being at this conference, in this audience, you have seen it many times before. These two girls, they were both from families who were recently immigrated from Mexico. And the parents did not speak English. The girls came to school not speaking English. And within a short amount of time, they started acquiring language really, really quickly. And I work really closely with our language acquisition department and to see and work with those testers. So when they're testing students for language, see where they are in their language acquisition, I teach them what to look for in these students that they're testing for language. And so I meet with them every year, and I really recommend other districts to do this because we need to show ELL teachers and some folks in the language acquisition department what to look for when they're testing these students for language development, because they do acquire language much, much more quickly, commonly. And so these 2 girls, they shared some very interesting experiences, I should say. For one thing, both of them were identified as gifted using an NNAT, a nonverbal test. They were both included into their gifted programs. Now, once again, different schools, different age levels, didn't know each other, but they had some really common outcomes that we found. One was for some, they didn't feel accepted. Remember when I said, do all the students feel like they had the same outcome? Well, they certainly did not. They felt ostracized they in the gifted program because they spoke Spanish, their skin was brown, they had different customs, different cultures. Say they didn't really fit in. They didn't feel like they fit in in some ways. And another really interesting but very sad thing is both of them, in order to try to fit in, they both stopped speaking Spanish to their parents for an entire year, which is bizarre that they don't even know each other when in this story emerged. So it stands to reason that there's other students that are really struggling to be accepted, other smart kids that are struggling to be accepted in some of these programs. Another really odd thing that is their friends and their culture groups stopped hanging around them. They thought they were trying to be different, trying to act white, trying to be, you're smarter than us, you're trying to be better than us. So these girls felt very, very isolated in their school. And actually they both at some point in their time seriously considered suicide. So this is the stress that we're putting on students when they don't feel accepted, acknowledged for who they are. And the schools have these mindsets, in biases, sometimes some stereotypes of what a gifted child should look like. And a lot of the school, like when I went into my story about when I came into my school district, and they didn't want to, some of the teachers didn't want to include these kids because they weren't as advanced. So this is some of the baggage that these students hold on to. So what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about is different ways to address that. And we've been talking about multiple measures for identification. That's what we're talking about here. Different ways of looking at giftedness and measuring high ability. But we also have to think about multiple pathways, because if a gifted child is identified at that national norm at 97, 98, 99, they are fluent in English, they have all these background experiences that have given them opportunities that other students have, they might need a different something else, but these students really need our attention. So what I want to do, in addition to the universal testing, which Kim just described, we also have to have more a continuum of services. And so what I do in my district is we flex these students in at our Title I schools. So you can go to the next slide. And by flexing in, what I mean is I don't stand by the national norms, or that even the state of Arizona where I'm at says 97 or above in one area. But there's nothing in most state statutes that say, but you can't also bring these other students in. So when you use these district or building norms to identify students with your population, you take the highest percentage of those students that Kim said who are just significantly removed from the norm at that school, and those are the students that we want to serve. Those are the students we want to group together, because the data shows that they need something different than the other students in that school. So I call this the gifting program dilemma, the chicken or the egg. So a lot of districts have these programs that say, and this is my district as well, there's a lot of, I call it Tatwadi going around. That's the way we've always done it. And so in my district, they were doing gifted the same way for 28 years before I came. And they were looking for students that fit into the existing model, ignoring the fact that these kids have high potential and high ability that doesn't fit into that format, that structure. So what I like to say is that, first of all, we identify potential, group the students together, and then decide what approach we need to take to make sure that they are going to be challenged at their level and progress through at their own levels. And a lot of times that means we really have to look at the type of gifted programming that we provide. So I'm just going to give you a very, very brief overview of 4 different very common models in gifted education. And let's look at those through an equity lens. So first of all, if you know any of my work, I do a lot on cluster grouping and flexible grouping. I think it's very important to have flexible learning groups in classes and to cluster group these students together. By doing this, we don't have to say, you have to have a 97 and you have to get straight A's on your report card, then you could come into our gifted program. What I do is I group the students that I've identified at each building that have high potential and that have that ability to learn that's advanced. And so at every grade level has a cluster class where the gifted identified students or the students that we identify as gifted at that school are grouped together. Then we work with those teachers, the teachers work with those students to make sure that we are addressing those learning needs and the social emotional needs of all of those students. So that's the most equitable in my eyes. Another way that I just started describing in my district with the honors classes, this is something we can work toward to with our students that we're identifying that might not be fluent in English or have some of those experiences, but we can also flex those students into the honors classes. If we don't flex them into the honors classes, many times they're not going to be included, because a lot of times with honors classes, you have to have the high ability and the high achievement, or in some honors classes, you just have to have that high achievement. So what does it leave us for our students with high ability that do not have that achievement? So if your school or school district is using honors classes or content replacement or whatever you want to call it, just keep that in mind and think about who we might be missing. Some of those more than 1 million students that Jack was talking about, most likely. Enrichment classes are a fantastic idea for gifted students because it builds on their interests, their areas that they would like to pursue. It could be something as like architecture projects, solar system project. A lot of these are like project based, and that's wonderful because it's really motivating for gifted students. However, if that's all you're doing, then you really need to think about grouping their students together as well, because enrichment classes are oftentimes by a gifted teacher who's going to come to my school on Tuesday at 1 o'clock and take care of all the gifted students. Well, we know these kids are gifted all day, every day, and everything that they do. So grouping them together and training the teachers is critically important. And then the last a model that also is seems to be very exclusive in many, if not most districts, programs is the self-contained gifted program. And that's where they look at high ability plus high achievement. Whose students are accelerated and they build on that acceleration. There's ways that you can tweak all of these models, regardless of the one your school is using, but you have to make sure that you're being inclusive about them. You're giving them potential to strategies to build up some of that high ability. I'll give you a couple of examples, really, really brief examples of what this could look like. Next slide. So what I see a lot is that people a lot of times they hide from some of their achievement data, their gifted identified student data they're afraid of that population and so I take the opposite approach. I want to make sure I want to measure and record the ethnic representation of all the gifted students identified in the district, because that draws attention to school administrators saying, wait a minute, we've got smart kids that we're not identifying, which is the whole purpose of our test. We also want to make sure that we're looking at the academic achievement of gifted students so that we can better support the teachers and how the professional development that we provide to them so that they can help those gifted children achieve in academics at a more advanced pace because they have that potential. We also want to measure the gifted population that's identified and served each year. And this gives impetus to having some of using those building norms and universal testing, because if we look at that data, sometimes we'll see we're identifying girls or boys more than girls, which is not uncommon, or kids in grades 4 through or higher, which is also not uncommon. I want to start early childhood. We start preschool and kinder, measuring ability, because the earlier we get them, especially some with our ELL population, some of our diverse populations, some of these students may not have had some of these opportunities to learn. If we get them early, we can help develop those students, especially those with high ability. It's also important to measure and record and pay attention to the professional learning opportunities that we are providing to our teachers to help them recognize the strengths in these students. And with all of this data, we make it a point to share that with the principal, the school district administration, and some of our website, anywhere we can, because this sends a message of urgency to see we can do better with these students. And very briefly, I'll show you a couple slides of This was in my previous district. When I was the gifted coordinator there, I started in year 1, and we tracked this data for 6 years. And we started cluster grouping them, the students who identified, and first of all, identifying using the NNAT, the Nonverbal Ability Test, and then grouping them. And each year we did that, those numbers increased. So when we started, we had a 2.67% identified as gifted. And by the time we finished this, it was 8%, which actually replicated the state data. But the next slide will show you what really was important. What we saw here in this district, 78% of the students who in the gifted identified program were white. Just so happens that 80% of the students at the time in the district were Hispanic. So that means that we were doing a really good job of identifying smart kids who spoke English, who were white. And we're not doing a very good job with the others. So when you saw that last slide, when I said we started doing universal testing and grouping these students, and after 6 years, look at the increase in the Hispanic students. At the 6th year, they represented 80% of our gifted students. And we didn't do any harm to the white students. They continued to increase, but we really focused on making sure that we were providing equitable identification practices and services. So the last slide I'll show you right here is back to my current district. And when I was saying that I like to make sure that I'm putting this data out there, this is why it's so important. If you put it out there and you share and you say, we're missing the boat on these kids, then it's going to be impetus to district administration, school boards, those types of folks who are in leadership and decision-making roles to be able to say, we need to do something differently with these students.
So just to kind of wrap things up, and kind of pull everything together, I think the message from today is that we can do better with verbal and quantitative tests. And when combined with a nonverbal test, and when we have procedures that allow the students to solve these questions, regardless of the language that they speak, and in ways that doesn't require advanced academic knowledge, that's how we can achieve equitable assessment. So as Dina and Kim have been saying, we've been working on this problem for a long time. I think we've really come a long way and really improved a lot. Kim, can you go back a slide, please? So if you want to get more information about these 3 general ability tests, you can go to mhs.com, which is the publisher. You can certainly be in touch with any of us. You can certainly be in touch with Debbie Roby, who's the person to contact if you're interested in actually getting the tools. And if you want more information in general, I encourage you to go to our website, the Naglieri Gifted Test.com. And there you'll see a whole bunch of information about the new tests, what they look like, and that's the place to go for updates. And Dina and Kim, I guess I just want to end with this, and maybe you might want to say anything else as we end today. I love this quote from Martin Luther King. This is right near where I live, near Washington, D.C., at the monument there. Make a career of humanity. Commit yourself to the noble struggle for equal rights. You will make a greater person of yourself, a greater nation of your country, and a finer world to live in. And that's really what we're about here. We're really trying to help so many students, those more than 1 million students out there who are really smart and deserve a place at the table, so to speak.
And I'll just conclude with saying, I walked in your shoes for many years. I was a bilingual teacher. I was an ESL teacher. I was a cluster teacher. I was a bilingual cluster teacher. But what I was able to see some things in students that some of my colleagues, other teachers, didn't see, maybe because I have come from a Hispanic family, maybe because I speak the language, but for whatever the reason, we're missing these kids. And our efforts here are to try to take away some of those obstacles that are preventing us from recognizing that potential and make that reality, that understanding available to all teachers, regardless of their cultures and backgrounds, so that we can do better and serve our students better.
I'll finish up today just by, it's so hard not to be able to see your faces and get feedback from you. But we know that this is a paradigm shift, but it's a long time coming, and the time is now. But we want you to know that we are very available to you. If you are sitting there listening to this today and saying, I really want to do this, but I don't know how to get started, the three of us are pretty available. And so please reach out to us if there is some way that we can help you. So thank you for joining us today, everyone, and have a great day.